Every Tuesday morning for 9 years, the same white refrigerated van pulled up behind Harlan Doyle's small butcher shop in Guelph, Ontario, and unloaded whatever the Meridian Food Group didn't want to deal with anymore. Not regular orders, not scheduled inventory, problem stock. A pallet of beef tenderloins, with inconsistent marbling that Meridian's quality team had flagged and rejected for their hotel accounts. A shipment of heritage pork that had been mislabeled somewhere in the supply chain, and couldn't be traced cleanly enough for a corporate audit. 40 kilograms of dry-aged ribeye that had developed a crust Meridian's newer butchers didn't recognize and didn't know how to handle. Always something broken. Always something that required more knowledge than Meridian's own processing team had patience for. And every Tuesday Harlan took it in. No phone call asking if it was convenient, no acknowledgement that what they were bringing him was genuinely difficult. Just a manifest, a transfer form, and whatever the van carried. He signed the paperwork at the back door while his son, Owen, still half asleep, ate cereal at the counter inside. The money was reliable. That was the thing. In a business where reliable meant everything, where rent on the shop was due the first of every month, and Owen's hockey fees came out in September, and the furnace in the apartment above the shop had needed replacing 2 winters running, reliable wasn't nothing. Reliable was actually everything. So Harlan said yes every Tuesday. And then he went to work. Harlan Doyle was 43 years old, and had been a butcher since he was 19, which meant he had been breaking down animals longer than he had been doing almost anything else. He had learned from his uncle in a shop not unlike this one, a place that smelled of sawdust and cold metal, and the particular sweetness that comes from fresh-cut bone. His hands showed it. Wide palms, thick fingers, the kind of grip that came not from a gym but from years of actual physical resistance. Holding a boning knife against cartilage, hauling primal cuts from the walk-in, lifting and turning and separating things most people preferred not to think about. He wasn't a large man exactly. Medium height, solid through the shoulders, brown eyes that had gone a little tired around the edges in the last few years. He kept his dark hair short and his apron clean. He was methodical in a way that looked almost slow until you watched him work, at which point it became clear that what looked like slowness was actually precision, the kind built over decades until it no longer required thought. His wife, Sandra, had died 5 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in January, gone by June. Owen had been 8 at the time. He was 13 now, tall for his age, quieter than most of his classmates, and fiercely loyal to his father in the way children become when they've watched a parent carry something heavy for a long time without putting it down. The shop was called Doyle & Son, which had been its name since Harlan's uncle opened it decades ago, and which Harlan had never changed even after his uncle retired, partly out of sentiment, and partly because it now fit again. Meridian Food Group was not the kind of company that wasted time noticing small businesses. They operated out of a glass and steel building in Mississauga, ran accounts with restaurant chains, hospital food services, hotel groups, and institutional buyers across Ontario and Quebec. Their executive team wore lanyards to internal meetings and talked about vertical integration and margin optimization. Their fleet of refrigerated vans covered southern Ontario in overlapping routes that looked, on a logistics map, like an enormous spider web. Harlan's shop was a single dot near the edge of that web, not strategically important, not interesting, just useful in the specific, minor, Tuesday morning way that a company finds something useful when they need a problem to disappear quietly. The director of procurement at Meridian, who had originally arranged the arrangement, was a man named Gerald, who had retired 3 years in. After that, the invoices came from a different name. Then another. Nobody at Meridian ever visited. Nobody called except to confirm the van's arrival window. For 9 years, the relationship between Harlan Doyle and Meridian Food Group consisted almost entirely of signed manifests and monthly e-transfers. The woman who had built Meridian into what it was, its founder and, for the past 12 years its CEO, had never, to Harlan's knowledge, been aware he existed. Her name was Diane Pollack. If you followed the business press in Ontario during the mid-2010s and early 2020s, you knew Diane Pollack. She was the kind of executive who showed up in profiles about women reshaping the food industry, whose headshot appeared on conference banners, whose quotes about supply chain innovation got shared by other executives, who wanted to appear thoughtful. She had grown Meridian from a regional meat distributor into a diversified food services company with contracts in 3 provinces. She was 51. She was by every visible metric, formidable. What the profiles didn't cover, because companies manage what gets covered, was that Meridian's growth had come at a cost that wasn't appearing on any of the public-facing documents. Rapid expansion had created a supplier network so large and loosely managed that quality control had become inconsistent. Audits were being handled internally rather than independently. Some of the company's institutional contracts, particularly hospital food services, required certifications that, on closer examination, weren't fully current. The company had been running fast enough that nobody at the executive level had stopped to look carefully at the ground beneath their feet. The first sign of trouble came as a food safety investigation from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Then a second, related complaint from a hospital supply chain manager in Hamilton. Then a story in a trade publication that got picked up by 2 larger outlets. Then 3 institutional clients suspended their contracts pending review. Within 4 months, Meridian was in crisis. Not terminal, not yet, but the kind of crisis that makes boards convene emergency sessions and makes executives stop sleeping properly. Revenue had dropped sharply. 2 senior managers had resigned. A law firm in Toronto had begun making calls on behalf of one of the hospital groups. It was during this period, a gray Thursday morning in November, the kind of morning that feels like the sky has given up, that a junior analyst at Meridian, tasked with auditing third-party processing arrangements, found something unexpected in the company's invoicing records. A small butcher shop in Guelph. 9 years of weekly invoices, problem stock, rejected shipments, difficult product with documentation issues, and a processing and resolution record that was, without exception, clean. Everything Meridian had sent to Harlan Doyle had come back correctly handled, correctly documented, without a single complaint, without a single return, without a single audit flag. The analyst flagged it. Her manager looked at it. Her manager's manager brought it to the operations director. And eventually the file sat on Diane Pollock's desk on a Thursday morning with a yellow sticky note on it that read, "Do we know who this is?" The honest answer was no. Nobody at Meridian's headquarters knew who Harlan Doyle was. For 9 years, they had been sending him their most difficult problems, and he had been solving them, quietly, reliably, invisibly, and they had been signing the e-transfer and moving on. Diane stared at the file for a long time. 9 years of records, dozens of problem shipments, not a single failure. She drove to Guelph herself, no assistant, no communications manager, no advance call, she just got in her car and drove. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like your best work was going unnoticed, or if you know someone who keeps showing up quietly and doing the hard thing while others take credit, like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Resilience Tales. We tell the stories that don't always make headlines but probably should. Harlan was in the middle of breaking down a side of beef when the shop door opened, and someone came in who wasn't a regular customer. He noticed it before he turned around. Something about the quality of the silence that followed the bell above the door. Regular customers made a noise when they came in, shifted their weight, called out a hello, moved toward the counter. This person stood still. He set down the knife, wiped his hands on the front of his apron, and turned. She was in her early 50s, well dressed in a dark coat, and she was looking around the shop with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not quite discomfort. Something more like the look a person gets when they've arrived somewhere they should have come a long time ago and they know it. "Doyle and Son?" she said. "That's right, I'm looking for Harlan Doyle. You found him." She introduced herself, Diane Pollock, CEO, Meridian Food Group. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the clock on the wall. Owen would be home from school in 2 hours. And then he looked back at her. "All right," he said. "Give me a minute." He finished covering the beef, washed his hands at the sink, and came around to the front of the counter. There were 2 stools near the window that he sometimes put out for customers waiting for special orders. He put one out for her, and leaned against the display case himself. What followed was a conversation that was, by any external measure, a strange one. The CEO of a mid-sized food services company, standing in a butcher shop in Guelph, explaining to a man she had never met, that her company was in serious trouble, and that the data suggested, not politely, but directly, that he might be one of the few people who could help. Harlan listened without interrupting. That was something people tended to notice about him eventually. He listened to problems the way he listened to meat. Patiently, without rushing toward a conclusion, waiting for the thing to tell him what it actually needed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been sending me your problem stock for 9 years, he said. "Yes. And you're only here now, because something went wrong." She didn't flinch from it, which he respected. "Yes," she said again. Through the door behind the counter, he could hear the faint sound of the television. Owen had come home early from school that day, a shortened period, some kind of staff meeting, and he was upstairs in the apartment watching something. Harlan thought about that. He thought about Owen eating cereal at the counter on Tuesday mornings, while the Meridian van backed up to the door. He thought about 9 years of problems arriving without ceremony, and leaving solved. He thought about the fact that the solution to every one of those problems had lived, the entire time, right here, in this shop, in his hands. "Tell me about the certification issue," he said. It took 3 weeks of initial consultation, before Harlan understood the full shape of what Meridian was dealing with. It wasn't one problem. It was a system that had grown faster than its own internal knowledge could keep up with. Corners had been cut not out of malice, but out of the particular corporate blindness that comes from promoting people into management before they've had enough time to actually learn what they're managing. The food safety issues were fixable. The documentation gaps were fixable. The supplier inconsistency was fixable. None of it was beyond repair. But fixing it required someone who understood, at a fundamental level, how food moved through a processing and distribution system. Not from a logistics software dashboard, but from the inside. From the floor. From the cold room, and the processing table, and the back dock where things actually happened. Harlan knew. He had spent 24 years knowing, in the specific and unglamorous way that comes from doing rather than overseeing. He drove to Mississauga twice a week. He spent time in Meridian's facilities. He talked to the processing workers, who were initially suspicious, and then, gradually, relieved. Here was someone who understood what they were describing. When they described it, who didn't need it translated into executive language, who recognized a problem by its smell, and its texture, and the way a piece of equipment sounded when something was slightly off. The younger staff in particular responded to him. There was a woman named Kelly, who ran the second shift in the main processing facility, and who had been flagging the same equipment calibration issue for 8 months, without anyone at the management level taking it seriously. Harlan spent 40 minutes with her one afternoon, looked at what she was pointing at, and confirmed immediately that she was right. The fix took a licensed technician 2 hours. The issue had been costing them yield inconsistency for the better part of a year. "How long have you been trying to get someone to look at this?" Harlan asked. Kelly shrugged, in the way people shrug when they've been ignored enough times that the shrug has become automatic. "Since March." Harlan went back to the main office and had a different kind of conversation than he'd had there before. Owen understood that something had changed in the way a 13-year-old understands things. Not through what is said, but through what he can feel in the space around the person he knows best. His father started coming home later on Wednesdays. He started getting phone calls in the evenings, which he took standing at the kitchen window, with his hand on the back of his neck. Which was what he did when he was thinking hard. He started keeping a notepad on the kitchen table. One night Owen sat down across from his father while Harlan was going through a stack of processing protocols and said, "Is the shop okay?" Harlan looked up. "The shop's fine, are you okay?" Harlan put down his pen. He looked at his son, this tall, quiet, serious boy, who had been watching him for 5 years now, watching for signs of trouble the way children who have lost one parent watch the remaining one. "I'm better than I've been in a while," he said, and meant it. Owen thought about that. "Is it the big company thing?" "Yeah, are they paying you?" Harlan almost smiled. "Yes, Owen, they're paying me." Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to his homework. By the second month the CFIA investigation had begun to move in a more positive direction. Meridian had engaged an independent auditor. Harlan had recommended one he'd worked with before, and the audit was producing findings that, while not comfortable, were at least clear. Clear was better than murky. Clear meant fixable. 2 of the 3 suspended institutional contracts had agreed to pause rather than terminate, while the audit completed. The third was still uncertain. Diane spent more time in the processing facilities during this period than she had in years. She had run Meridian from above, for long enough that she had forgotten what the actual operations looked like at ground level, and what she found when she came down from the executive floor was both instructive and, in places, difficult. She watched Harlan work. The way he explained something to a processing worker was different from the way her managers explained things. He didn't explain toward compliance. He explained toward understanding. He made sure the person in front of him could actually do the thing, not just follow the instruction. It was slower. It stuck better. She watched him one afternoon, going through a receiving procedure, with a young man named Ben, who had been on the dock crew for less than a year. Ben was nervous. The CEO was in the building, and everyone knew it, but Harlan was talking to him the same way he would have talked to him on any other afternoon, which is to say, directly, clearly, without condescension, with occasional dry humor that came out so naturally, it took a second to recognize it as humor at all. Ben got it. His posture changed. He asked a follow-up question, and Harlan answered it, as though it was the most reasonable question anyone had asked all day. Diane stood in the doorway and thought about 9 years of Tuesday mornings. 9 years of problems she had never bothered to understand arriving at a dock in Guelph, and being handled, every single time, by someone she had never once called on the phone. She thought about the way her company had been structured, and the distance that structure had put between the executive level and the people doing the actual work. And about how long it had taken a crisis to show her that distance for what it was. Do you think this happens more than we realize? Companies losing sight of the people who are actually holding things together? Leave a comment. We read them. The third institutional contract came back. It was a hospital network. 7 facilities across southwestern Ontario, and their supply chain director had been, understandably, the most skeptical of the 3. Her name was Margaret Firth, and she was the kind of person who didn't accept assurances, only evidence. Harlan had been part of the conversation that brought her back, not because he had said reassuring things, but because he had answered her specific technical questions, with specific technical answers. And she had recognized, apparently, that he knew what he was talking about. "Who is that?" she had asked Diane afterward. "He's a butcher in Guelph," Diane said. Margaret Firth had looked at her with an expression that was hard to interpret. "You might want to keep him," she said. The conversation about a formal arrangement happened on a Tuesday morning, a coincidence that wasn't lost on Harlan. Diane came to the shop. Not Mississauga, the shop. She arrived just before 8, before Owen left for school, and she stood at the counter while Owen ate toast, and watched her with the frank, unhurried assessment of a 13-year-old who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't looking at someone. "This your kid?" Diane asked Harlan. "This is Owen." Owen raised one hand in acknowledgement without looking up from his toast. Diane made the offer she had come to make. A formal consulting role, Director of Quality Operations, which was a real title with real authority, not a lateral move dressed up in new language. She laid out the terms. She was clear that she wanted him on site at least part-time, that she understood it would require flexibility, and that she was prepared to build that flexibility into whatever arrangement they made. Harlan listened, then he said, "Owen's in school until 3:15. Hockey Tuesday nights, Thursday nights. I'm not available those evenings." "Okay. The shop stays open, I won't close it." Diane nodded. "And I want to be able to bring in the independent auditor whenever I feel it's warranted, not just on a scheduled cycle whenever." There was a pause. That last condition was the one she hadn't expected. It was also, as she recognized while sitting with it, the most important one. "Okay," she said. Owen had finished his toast and was putting on his jacket. He stopped by the counter on his way to the door and looked at Diane. "His hands smell like oil because of the knives," he said, apparently feeling this required explanation. "Not because he doesn't wash them." Diane blinked. "Good to know. He's really good at what he does," Owen said, with the particular matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has never had reason to believe otherwise. And then he was out the door, backpack over one shoulder, headed down the street toward school. Harlan watched him go, then he turned back to Diane. "All right," he said. The next 6 months were not easy, which is worth saying clearly, because stories about second chances sometimes skip the part where the actual work is hard. Rebuilding a quality management system inside a company that had outpaced its own expertise wasn't quick. There were internal politics. There were people at the management level who found Harlan's directness, his refusal to soften a problem in order to make it more palatable to whoever was hearing it, difficult to work with. One senior manager, who had been at Meridian for 7 years and had strong opinions about the way things had always been done, resigned. 2 others adjusted. Harlan was not diplomatic in the traditional sense. He didn't smooth things over, but he was fair, and he was consistent, and the people who actually did the work, the floor workers, the dock staff, the processing crew, the shift supervisors like Kelly, knew it. They started coming to him with things. Problems they had been carrying quietly for months, sometimes years, not because they expected magic, but because they had figured out that he would actually look. He kept the shop in Guelph open 4 days a week. His regular customers, the ones who had been coming in for years, who asked after Owen, who knew what the specials were before Harlan put them on the board, they stayed. A few new ones came, people who had read a small mention in a regional business publication. A 4-paragraph story about the Guelph butcher who'd helped a struggling food company sort itself out. Harlan hadn't talked to the journalist, someone else had. Owen started telling his friends that his dad worked for a company in Mississauga. Then he corrected himself. His dad worked for a company in Mississauga, and also ran a shop in Guelph. He seemed to feel the distinction was important. On a Tuesday morning in February, not a significant Tuesday, just a regular one, Harlan was at the shop early, before Owen was up, standing at the back door with a cup of coffee. It was cold, the way Guelph is cold in February, the kind of cold that feels personal, like it's specifically aimed at you. He was looking at the alley where the white Meridian van used to park. No van, today. The van had stopped coming 8 months ago, when the new arrangement formalized the processing work through the proper channels, scheduled deliveries, clear documentation, staff who knew what they were doing. But he stood there anyway, with his coffee, in the cold. He was thinking about Sandra. He did that sometimes in the early mornings, before the day got loud enough to fill everything up. She had believed, firmly, and without any particular fanfare, that what he did mattered, that the skill of it mattered, that the care of it mattered, that a person who could look at a piece of meat and understand what it needed was doing something real. She had said it in the plain, non-sentimental way she said most things, which had somehow made it more convincing than if she had made a speech about it. He thought about the 9 years of Tuesday mornings she had missed. He thought about Owen, upstairs, starting to stir. Then he finished his coffee, set the cup on the ledge, and went inside to start the day. Harlan Doyle did not become famous. He did not appear on a conference banner or get profiled in a national magazine. Meridian's recovery was covered in trade publications and in the business section of 2 Toronto papers, and his name was mentioned in one of them, in a sentence, as part of a longer description of the quality management overhaul. His uncle, who was in his 80s and read the paper every morning, called him that day. "I saw your name in the paper," his uncle said. One sentence, Harlan said, still counts. What actually changed was quieter than headlines. The floor workers at Meridian's main facility had a direct line to someone who listened to them now. The independent audits ran on a schedule that was real, rather than ceremonial. 2 of the younger processing staff had been moved into quality roles after Harlan pointed out, in a meeting, that they had been doing quality work for years, and were simply doing it without the title or the pay. They got both. Kelly, the second shift supervisor who had been ignored for 8 months about the equipment calibration issue, was promoted. She sent Harlan a text message the day it was announced that said only, "Thank you for looking." He read it 3 times. Owen made the A-Division hockey team in the spring. He came home with the paper in his hand, the one with the team list on it, and he stood in the shop doorway and held it up without saying anything, and Harlan came around the counter and hugged him in a way that made Owen squirm and grin at the same time. That evening, Diane Pollock called. Not about Meridian. She had heard, through some chain of connection that neither of them could fully trace afterward, that Owen had made the team. She called to say congratulations. It was a brief call, a bit awkward in the way calls are when they're about something personal between people who met under professional circumstances, and when it ended, Owen looked at his father and said, "Who was that?" "The CEO," Harlan said. Owen considered this. "Why does the CEO know about my hockey team?" "I honestly couldn't tell you." Owen shrugged and went back to his room. There is a version of this story that ends with a dramatic scene, a symbolic moment, the kind of cinematic arrival that makes it easy to locate exactly where things turn. But the truth is that things turning rarely looks like that. More often it looks like a Tuesday morning, and a cup of coffee in the cold, and a man going back inside to do the work he's always known how to do. Except this time, someone finally noticed. There are people in every industry, in every city in this country, doing exactly what Harlan did. Holding things together quietly. Solving problems other people created. Keeping the lights on in someone else's building without anyone upstairs knowing the lights were ever at risk. Most of them will never get a phone call from the CEO. Most of them will never get a sentence in the paper. They'll get a reliable e-transfer if they're lucky. And the private knowledge that they're the reason something still works. That knowledge matters. Even when nobody says so. Even when nobody knows. Hard work doesn't always get recognized when it should. But sometimes, eventually, the thing you were quietly holding up becomes the only thing standing between someone else and the floor. And then, finally, they look.